Hey guys, Pastor Darvin here from Mission Lakewood Church, coming to you with our Monday, Wednesday, Friday devotions. It is Holy Week and it is Wednesday of Holy Week. And Wednesday of Holy Week, we look at Jesus' betrayal by Judas. So we're going to look at this story today and what it really has to say in our lives. And we're going to bounce between some of the different gospel accounts so we can get a good idea of what happened that Wednesday of Holy Week as Judas betrayed Jesus. All right, so we're going to actually start in Luke chapter 22 with this story of betrayal, and we read this. Chapter 22 of Luke, verse 1, Now the festival of unleavened bread called the Passover was approaching, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for a way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people. They're afraid of losing power, right? Just a few days before, on Palm Sunday, Jesus had entered the city, and he's being declared by some to be the Messiah and the King. They're worried that they're going to lose their position. They're worried they're going to lose their power, and so they're looking for a way to kill him. Verse 3, Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. So this means that he wasn't demonically possessed in maybe a similar way that we see earlier in the Gospels with other people, but he was under Satan's control. Remember, he's been messing up. He's been having some things happen, shady things happen in the background. He's really left the door open for Satan to come into his life and influence him. Verse 4, And Judas went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and had discussions with them on how he might betray Jesus. They were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. Now, a lot of people over the years kind of look to give Judas an escape, kind of try to get him off the hook. It wasn't that bad, or he had to do this. No, he went and sought this out. He was the one who went to you can look at this in verse 4. Judas went to the chief priests. They didn't seek him. He sought them. In the other Gospels, we find that he was sold for 30 pieces of silver, that Judas sold Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver. Now, we don't know exactly how much 30 pieces of silver was worth. Maybe between a few $100s to $3,000, but this wasn't like $1 million. He sold them out for very, very little. Now, why could he sell them out for that little? Why was Judas so enticed by the money? Well, in John 12, we're told that Judas had been stealing from Jesus for years. That he had been, as people gave these wandering disciples following Jesus money so they could continue to go through the countryside of Israel through the 3 years of Jesus' ministry, Judas was in charge of the money, but he was stealing part of it. So money was really Judas's god. Money was really what Judas worshiped. So it didn't take that much money to convince Judas to betray Jesus. And so here we are. Here's the beginning of the betrayal story. Judas has gone and sought the chief priests out. Now he's looking for this opportunity to kill Jesus. And then we're going to flip over to Matthew. If you could flip over to Matthew chapter 26, and we're going to get the story of Jesus really starting to confront Judas. Remember, Jesus is God, so he knows this. I mean, Jesus, when he picked Judas to be one of his disciples, he knew that Judas was going to betray him someday. But he chose him anyway, because this was always the path Jesus was going to take. So here we go. Here's in Matthew 26, verse 17. Here's the confrontation between Jesus and Judas at the Last Supper. Jesus is knowing that he's going to be betrayed. So we read this starting in verse 17. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, Where do you want us to make the preparations for you to eat the Passover? He replied, Go into the city to a certain man and tell them, the teacher says, My appointed time is near. I'm going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house. So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them and prepared for the Passover. Now, if you've been a part of Mission Lakewood Church, earlier this year, we did a whole message series on the book of Exodus, and so you know what the Passover is. The Passover was when the people of Israel were slaves in Egypt, and God was trying to rescue them, and had brought in all these plagues, 9 plagues on the Egyptians before the final one of the Passover, and could not convince the Pharaoh of Egypt to let his people go. And so he was going to bring the death of the firstborn on all of Egypt. But he told his people, kill a firstborn lamb and take the blood and spread it over your doorway. In this way I'll know who to pass over and not take the lives of. So in this practical way, the first Passover lambs, that Passover lamb for each family in Israel during the Exodus, was the way that they were saved from death. Now, this has all sorts of meaning as you come in to Passover night when Jesus is just, I mean, he's hours away from dying for all of us and all of our sins to save us from death. So it was not a coincidence that all of this is happening on Passover, right? It's so rich, so much meaning here. Verse 20, when evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12, and while they were eating, he said to them, truly I tell you, one of you will betray me. They were very sad and began to say to him, one after the other, surely you don't mean me, Lord. And so Jesus says this in a way that is intentionally vague. He doesn't stand up and like, hey, Judas, you're going to betray me. Everybody get him, right? I mean, he just says, one of you is going to betray me. And he keeps it super vague. They don't know which one, and they're really upset, right? Surely you don't mean me, Lord. Verse 23. Jesus replied, the one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. Now, when I used to read this years ago, I used to think, well, that was obviously Judas, right? Maybe he like had his hand in the bowl at the same time as Jesus, and it was so obvious that it was Judas, but actually it wasn't. It wasn't. Jesus leaves this vague. You see, at this Seder dinner, as it was called, this Passover dinner, one of the first courses was you'd sit down and you'd have this meal, and there was this sauce made with herbs and fruit and nuts and wine, and then you would take your unleavened bread during the first course of this meal, and you'd like dip it into this sauce. All the disciples had been dipping into the sauce with Jesus. They're all reclined, right? They're like half laying down on their elbow, and they're all reaching over to dip in. And so when Jesus says this, when he says, the one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me, every disciple is like, oh wait, I dipped my hand in. They had all dipped their hand in. It wasn't just Judas. Now, Jesus is talking about Judas, but this would have made for a lot of alarm in their hearts, right? They would have been worried. Am I going to be the one that betrays Jesus? Verse 24, Jesus continues, the Son of Man will go just as it is written about him, but woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born. So Jesus knows that it's Judas, but he's leaving it vague for his disciples. But because he does know it's Judas, he's giving them a warning. This is going to come at a huge cost, right? Verse 25. Then Judas, the one who would betray him, that's going to give him that kiss in the garden to let the soldiers know that, hey, this one's Jesus. Judas, the one who would betray him, said, surely you don't mean me, Rabbi. Now, what I think is really interesting here, that's so easy to skip over, is that Judas calls him Rabbi. Now, by this point in the story, most of the other disciples, we see them calling him Lord, right? Lord means master, and with this connotation from the Old Testament word Lord, it means God. And so a lot of the other disciples, they get it. They're calling Jesus Lord. You're my master, you're my God. But he only calls him Rabbi, teacher here. So Judas' heart is just not in the same place as the other guys. He's not understanding who Jesus really is, which is part of the reason why he was so willing to betray him. He thinks Jesus is just a teacher, a rabbi, not a Lord, not master, not God. So Judas says to Jesus, surely you don't mean me, Rabbi. Jesus answered, you have said so. Okay, still really vague, right? Still really vague. So let's pop over, we get a little more detail in John. We get a little more detail of the end of this conversation. Jesus answered, this is John 13:26. Jesus answered, it is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. Then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. So Jesus told him, what you're about to do it quickly. But here's the interesting part. Verse 28, but no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. They don't know that Jesus is talking about Judas. Jesus knows it, but Jesus leaves it intentionally vague. So they don't know why Jesus is saying this. They don't know. If you pop back over to Matthew, they don't know. They say in verse 22, all of the disciples, they were very sad and began to say one after another, surely you don't mean me, Lord. Surely you don't mean me, Lord. Jesus left this so vague at this meal of which was going to betray him that they all were wondering, am I the enemy of God? Am I the enemy of Jesus? Am I the enemy that's going to betray Jesus here? And the answer was yes. You see, when we think about Holy Week, we usually only think about Judas's betrayal. But actually, all of Jesus' disciples betrayed him. All of them betrayed him. They all made themselves his enemy that week of Holy Week. You know, the other disciple that pops up in your mind is Peter, who denied him 3 times. Once in front of a little girl, and you're like, what is going on, Peter? You've made yourself Jesus' enemy. You've betrayed him. Judas wasn't the only one, and that's why Jesus leaves this vague. All the disciples are left wondering at the Last Supper, wait, did Jesus mean me? Am I going to be the one that makes him my enemy? Am I going to be the one that betrays Jesus? And they all did. And it wasn't just Judas, and it wasn't just Peter, it was all of them. You know, when Jesus dies, you're expecting in the story to read, well, then the disciples came and got his body and they buried him. Because any good friend would do that, right? But actually, none of them do. We read that a guy named Joseph of Arimathea, super random, not one of the 12 disciples, had to come and bury Jesus' body because all of Jesus' disciples betrayed him. They all made themselves his enemy, and they took off and they ran away. And a couple days later on Easter morning, you don't read that his own friends came to take care of his body. I mean, in the ancient world, you would take spices and you would care for a dead body so it would not decompose and rot and smell in a certain way. You don't find the 12 disciples doing that. No. You find a small group of women doing that because all of Jesus' disciples abandoned him. After his death, they all ran away. They all betrayed him. And then later, when he comes to them, finally, the resurrected Jesus, they're all just huddled and scared and waiting for what to do next in an upper room. All of Jesus' disciples, not just Judas, made themselves his enemy and betrayed him. Right? Particularly Judas in a very unique way, but all of them did. And here's the thing. We've all been Jesus' enemy. We have all betrayed him. You know, the book of Romans in chapter 5 verse 10 tells us this. For if we, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? Again, for if, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? We were all God's enemies. When we sin, when we betray him, we're setting ourselves up as his enemy. And then it's only through his death and then his life, as verse 10 tells us in Romans 5, that we are reconciled back to God. You know, a lot of times when we think of this whole faith thing, it's easy to slip into this mindset that I'm a pretty stinking decent person. In fact, I might even say I'm a pretty good person. And really what I needed was just God to come give me some nice inspiration and lead the way and kind of clean up some of my rough edges, but certainly I wasn't God's enemy. Certainly I didn't betray him like a Judas or a Peter who denied him or one of the other 12 disciples that abandoned him. No, 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 no. While we were God's enemies, we were all once God's enemies. Before the cross and the empty tomb, before we accept that and know him, we have all made ourselves enemies. We've all had times in our lives where we've abandoned God and betrayed him through sin or decisions away from our faith. And this Holy Week, as we think on the Wednesday where Judas betrayed Jesus, about that betrayal, we shouldn't be obsessed about just how horrible Judas was. No, we should see that as he made himself the enemy of God, so have we. We should be driven to our knees to see that we needed the cross. We needed the tomb later in that week, because it was through the cross and the tomb that we, who were once God's enemies, were reconciled to God. So this Holy Week, let us be brought low for a moment, you know? Let us be brought low on Good Friday as we see the cost of the cross. Let us be brought low when we see this betrayal of Judas, to see our own sin and how much we need God, how much we need that reconciliation. Because just like Judas, just like Peter, just like Jesus' disciples, we have all been enemies. And the only reason we know God is because of the cross. It is grace and nothing that we do. I pray that God would give you a blessed Holy Week, and that He would just work on your heart all week long to bring you into something new in a way that you've never experienced Him before. God bless.